I still see it the way the sun caught it, a thin silver bracelet no wider than a pencil eraser, winking up from a shallow dip in the sand like a star refusing to die out at dawn. It lay there where the ground sagged, a place the wind nursed soft, the kind of spot you'd walk past 100 times unless the land already had its hands on your memory. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I spent most of my working life measuring days by the color of the sky. Mornings at Furnace Creek started pale and powder blue, the kind of light that makes you promise yourself you'll be careful. By noon, heat would push the color right out of the air. Car doors thumped, ice chests rattled, and out-of-state plates rolled into the visitor center with sunburned drivers craning for shade. I kept a clean desk, a cracked leather chair, and a habit of counting hats when big groups came in cowboy brims, ball caps, straw numbers that told you who'd planned and who hadn't. That summer of 2001, the thermometer outside the ranger office was a jawbreaker, 120, 121, 122. DGF climbing like it had somewhere to be. Even the ravens sat fat and quiet on the signposts, beaks open to bleed off the heat. The day they walked in didn't feel different at first. The lobby door sighed against the air conditioning and a ripple of hot wind folded itself into the cooler air like smoke slipping under a door. A white rental SUV idled crooked in the slot by the curb, even that engine note sounding thirsty. They came up to the counter with the easy look of two people who travel well together. He had a ball cap with a faded minor league logo and a map already creased along the seam lines. She wore a plain ponytail and the kind of light shirt people forget to pack until it's too late. The names came later, but in my head, I tagged them immediately. Organized, curious, not in a hurry. I gave them the talk we give everyone. Carry more water than you think you'll need. Keep to the main routes. Tell someone where you're headed and check your watch when the shadows start to change. I pointed out distances with a pen, miles, not minutes, because time loses its meaning out there, and I've met too many folks who thought otherwise. He asked about the old borax roads and whether any of the mining sites were still visible from the main tracks. She studied the bulletin board while he spoke, eyes tracing the bright red stickers that warned about heat illness, the small print about road closures, the penciled note someone had left about a soft shoulder near Warm Springs. The center had its usual humming ritual, a soda can hissing open on the shaded bench, sandals scuffing grit across the tile kids cooling their faces in the bathroom sink until their mothers clucked them away. One of the interpretive rangers changed the slide by the door to the new day's high 126 DGF, posted big for the crowd, and the lobby went a little quieter as if the number itself could steal saliva. I remember the woman Lily leaning forward to read trail times and then glancing at her partner doing quick math in her head, like all teachers do when they're translating the world into something manageable. She bought postcards with juniper and canyon sunsets on them. He picked out a small pamphlet on desert hikes, the kind printed thin so a breeze can lift it right off a counter. Folks joke about Death Valley like it's just a hot postcard, but anyone who works there knows how the place contains silence. You feel it pooling behind you when the door closes, feel it sliding under the tires when you leave. Pavement, feel it press up against your ribs at midnight when the stars are so thick it's like the sky is holding its breath. I watched them step back into that silence and squint hard the way everybody does when they hit the glare. They moved simply, no wasted steps, no fluster, and there was affection in the way they traded the map between them. He tucked it into the crook of his elbow while she checked the two cold waters I'd suggested feeling for solid ice, like that might grant a little more time. We had a rhythm in those days. My lunch was usually at the staff table out back, peanut butter on white bread, an apple soft from the heat, a thermos that never kept tea as cold as it promised. After I'd make a lap around the lot and listen to the cars. You can hear trouble before you see it. Belts squealing, plastic softening the lazy idle that means the radiator wants a break. That afternoon, even the asphalt looked tired, scuffed to shine in the tire ruts, and I tightened the cap on the water spigot with my handkerchief so folks wouldn't strip it bare. A group from Ohio asked me if the salt flats really sit 282 feet below sea level. A German couple wanted to know if their rental compact could handle the gravel toward Badwater Basin. I said what I always said, go early, go slow, and if you see a cloud that looks like it might become a thought, turn around. Around 2, dispatch radioed a reminder about the heat advisory, and the board in my head shuffled the usual Dex cars to watch routes to mention twice names I'd scribbled into the log. It takes time to notice the small pieces, but when you've worked the desk long enough, the pieces stack themselves for you. I wrote Carter Hart 2 Waters pamphlet map folded to remote routes in neat block letters on a yellow pad I kept under my palm. I never kept those notes long. Most became scratch paper for kids who wanted to draw the big horned sheep on a ranger's badge. But I kept that sheet through end of shift, the way you sometimes keep a grocery receipt, even though you know you won't return anything. If you've never stood in Death Valley around 3 in the afternoon, I can tell you that light turns mean. Shadows shrink to a thin bruise and the air looks glassy, the distance wobbling above the hard pan like the whole world's underwater. The parking lot emptied and filled again in a restless tide. The mail carrier waved with just 2 fingers over the wheel and didn't stop. An older man from Lone Pine waited for the shade to cross another 6 inches before he'd leave the bench. I checked the trash barrel by the door and found the remains of a frozen lemonade the lid caved in like it had given up. Somewhere down by the campground, a generator coughed and went quiet. The ravens shifted 1 step to the left, 1 step to the right, calculating angles like old men at the track. Late afternoon brought that faint, fooling breeze that tricks people into thinking it's cooler. It isn't. It's a hairdryer pointed at the back of your neck. I made a second pot of coffee I knew nobody would want and thumbed sweat off the spine of the area map with a shop rag. A kid in a sun hat giggled at the taxidermy lizard in the case, and his mother mouthed sorry like she'd climbed over my desk. "He's part of the family," I told her. She smiled and said they'd promised themselves a quick look and then a swim back at the motel in Beatty, which is what families say when they're trying to outrun the heat with chlorinated hope. Near closing, I stepped outside to make sure our flagpole rope wasn't sizzling itself loose again. That's when I noticed the white SUV easing back out onto the road in a slow, careful line, blinkers unused because there's nobody to signal to out there but the sun. He touched the brim of his cap against the windshield glare like a man tipping hello to the day. She had her elbow out the open window, a folded map resting against her knee, the pamphlet tucked on the dash. No rush, no sign of nerves, just the quiet choreography of 2 people who trusted the plan they'd made together. I'm not a sentimental man by nature, but I remember this much because I rely on habits, and that afternoon every habit still fit. I finished the paperwork while the AC grumbled, initialed the log, and clipped the radio back into its charger. I wiped the salt ring off my hatband and set it on its hook. Before I left, I swapped out the heat advisory sheet, even though it said the same thing as yesterday's, and made sure the bold warning about carrying 1 gallon per person per day sat square at eye level. The custodial crew came humming their small machine across the tile, the wheels leaving brief wet tracks that flashed and disappeared as fast as breath on a mirror. My trailer sat behind the maintenance yard, a 60-foot rectangle of metal and good enough intentions. The walk there took me along the hard pan, where the night wind collects like a low tide of cool, and I could smell the faint hot penny tang of the generator coming back to life. I checked my mailbox. 2 flyers, 1 envelope from Inyo County. I didn't open, and watered the 3 scrappy plants I'd convinced myself could live here. Dinner was a skillet of eggs and toast in the pans left behind butter, washed down with water, that still tasted faintly like the pipes. I tuned the weather band out of habit and let the robotic voice recite numbers the way some men let baseball keep them company. Excessive heat warning through the weekend. Overnight lows in the upper 90s. Light and variable winds becoming southwesterly after midnight. the kind of music you fall asleep to if you've done this long enough. Right before dusk, I sat on the metal steps and watched the sky lay a pink strip along the funeral mountains. On a good night, you see one car's dust scratch a single line across the valley, and it feels civilized in a way nothing else here does. That evening, I watched for it without meaning to. A ribbon of beige rose and fell, then unraveled somewhere I couldn't see. Headlights pricked to life in the distance, and another pair farther off answered them like a call and response. The crickets started where the scrub still found enough groundwater to be brave, and a nightbird cut the edge of the lot with a shape like a black glove thrown quick. I went back inside to call my wife. She kept the night shift at the clinic in Pahrump twice a week back then, and I got her machine. She'd left our porch light on out of habit. She'd say later a signal we didn't need, but could never quite give up. I set my coffee cup upside down on the counter to keep out the tiny desert ants that always found the one sweet thing, then laid the yellow note page on top of the microwave so I'd remember to toss it in the morning. Somewhere near Warm Springs, night was making the heat bearable in the way night always does out here, just enough cool to think you can try one more mile before turning back. At the Beatty Motel, the clerk would be straightening the key tags into a neat row, counting the ones that weren't returned yet, same as every evening. In the ranger office, the duty phone sat in its cradle, and the red message light stayed dark. I told myself I'd call the station once more before I slept. Instead, I opened the window and let the warm breeze move the curtain like a hand smoothing a rumpled shirt. The valley went still in that particular way it does before midnight. The kind of quiet that isn't empty so much as full, loaded with heat and distance and things you can't see from a porch light. I left the radio on low and stretched out on the narrow bed, counting my breathing the way they taught us in the academy for days when your head won't slow down. Somewhere out there, a white SUV had its own small circle of light, and somewhere closer, the motel clerk picked up the desk phone and set it down again without dialing. My wife's voicemail ticked over to a second message I didn't leave. And in the dark between all of us, a map lay folded to a page I hadn't looked at yet. By the time I turned the lamp off, the park had settled into that thin, humming quiet you feel in your teeth. I watched the curtain rise and fall twice and waited for the duty phone to rattle the metal desk with a late-night question about miles or water or the best turnoff for stargazing. It didn't ring. Outside, the porch light burned longer than it needed to, and somewhere down the valley, a pair of headlights never showed. It was sometime after midnight when the desert began to talk again. Not with sound, not with wind, but with that low hum you feel in your chest when something's about to change. I'd been half asleep, boots still by the door, when the duty phone rattled across the metal desk. Static first. Then dispatch's voice calm but clipped, asking if I'd seen a white SUV with Nevada plates. The rental company had called in a late return, and a motel clerk in Beatty said a couple hadn't checked out in 2 days. Their names hit my ear like a small echo, Evan Carter and Lily Hart. The same couple who'd waved at me in the parking lot that afternoon, map folded to the hiking routes, her ponytail catching the sun. I told dispatch they'd stopped by on the 7th, early afternoon, friendly, well-prepared. I didn't say that I remembered her laugh or how he'd joked about sneaking in one more adventure. Those details don't belong in the log, but they live in your head all the same. Morning came pale and quiet, no breeze yet, just the heavy kind of heat that seeps up from the ground even before sunrise. I unlocked the visitor center, turned on the lights, and felt that strange hollow behind the ribs that says something's wrong before anyone confirms it. By noon, the rental agency sent over the plate number, and another ranger spotted tire tracks turning off Warm Springs Road around the same time the couple would have been heading back west. Nothing about that stretch of road was forgiving miles of washboard gravel and mirage light that eats depth perception alive. We logged the coordinates and started a simple check, the kind we do all summer, locate, verify, assist if needed. But before we even rolled the trucks, the temperature hit 119 degrees, and that meant every step had to count. I took the lead truck, my partner Joe riding shotgun with the long-range radio. The air shimmered above the hood, and the tires bit into sand like it was trying to swallow us whole. Out here, silence has layers. Engine noise sinks into it. Boots crunch and vanish inside it. Even breath feels heavy like it's being borrowed. After an hour, we came around a bend and saw something bright against the earth. It was the SUV, half buried up to the axle's one rear wheel swallowed by a dune. From a distance, it looked calm, untouched, the kind of stillness that doesn't invite worry yet. Up close, it changed. Keys still in the ignition. Doors locked. Windows rolled up tight. 2 empty water bottles in the console, a map crumpled on the seat with a single X marked in shaky ink. I leaned in through the driver's window, saw her sunglasses in the cup holder, one arm snapped clean off. There's a silence particular to vehicles left in the sun. The metal pops softly as it cools a sound like breathing. I walked a slow circle around the SUV, scanning for footprints, drag marks, anything. The sand had already erased most of it, but near the trunk, under the shadow of the open hatch, I caught what might have been 2 faint indentations. Maybe knees, maybe wind, maybe nothing. Joe called in the find while I took photos for the report standard shots timestamps orientation. But each click of the shutter felt like I was documenting the edge of something that didn't want to be seen. The search started within hours. Rangers, SAR volunteers, even a helicopter from China Lake circling wide above the canyon. We used the SUV as the hub, drawing grid lines out in every direction. Every mile you walk in that heat costs more water than your body can store, so the teams rotated in 2-hour shifts, voices crackling through radios as we logged each section. No sign moving east. Copy over. The heat didn't ease up even after sunset. It just changed shape, sitting heavy in the air like a presence that refused to leave. I remember standing by the vehicle, looking out at the ridges, trying to picture the path they might have taken. People don't just vanish, I told myself. But in Death Valley, sometimes they do. That first night we found nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of fabric, not a reflection from a lens or buckle. Just the wide dark and the hum of the generators keeping the command post alive. The next morning, a park biologist joined us. Someone who knew the terrain like the back of his hand. He traced his finger along a topographic map and pointed to a cluster of old mining claims about 2 miles from where the SUV sat. Anvil Canyon, he said. Used to be shafts there early 1930s before they got buried by the storms. I felt something tighten in my gut. Evan's map had that same word scrawled in the corner next to the X. By day 3, we'd widened the search to the surrounding gullies. The helicopters flew low, their shadows sweeping across the sand like dark wings. From above, everything looks the same muted tan cracked white faint ridges where wind has drawn its own maps. But the desert hides depth. One wrong ridge, and you're in a labyrinth of dry washes and blind turns. Around midday, Joe found a small leather-bound notebook, wedged between the passenger seat and console, sun-warped, but still legible. It was Evan's handwriting notes about rest stops, miles driven, the kind of quick thoughts you scribble before the next turn. Then a few lines near the end that made my throat go dry. Locals said there's a cave near Warm Springs. Old mine, maybe. Checking it out tomorrow. Quick look, nothing crazy. The next page was smeared ink bled out like it had sweated through the paper. We sent the notebook to evidence and brought in old mining maps from archives that hadn't been touched in decades. Most of those records were vague, handwritten by prospectors who measured distance by time and intuition. Still, the coordinates lined up close enough to make you wonder. That night, while we packed up gear, a younger volunteer asked me quietly if I thought they might have found the cave. I told him what I believed at the time, that they'd gone farther than planned, got turned around, maybe sought shade in one of those gullies, and ran out of water before morning. But even as I said it, I knew how rare it was for 2 people to leave no sign at all. Days turned into a week. The official operation paused at dusk each night, but a few of us stayed up checking wind direction, going over satellite images. Emily Evans' sister arrived on the 5th day. She stood beside the command tent watching the searchers move out at dawn, hands twisting a tissue the whole time. When the news crew came, she spoke softly into their camera, said her brother wasn't reckless, said they planned everything that he loved, maps and old stories, but knew his limits. You could see it on her face, though, that small edge between belief and knowing. In town, the talk started. Locals at the gas station, the diner, even the tourists passing through, everyone had a theory. Some swore they must have stumbled into trouble, that the back roads were used for things the Park Service didn't want to find. Others said it was the same curse that took the German family years before a wrong turn that turned into tragedy. I listened without answering. You learn to let people fill silence however they need to. Out here, stories grow like cactus, slow, sharp, and almost impossible to uproot once they take hold. A prospector named Red McKinley stopped by the office one evening, hat in hand, dust thick on his boots. Said he'd heard we were asking about caves near Anvil Canyon. There's one out there, he told me, eyes narrowed against the setting sun. Saw it myself back in the 70s, half covered by a slide. Didn't go in, ground felt wrong underfoot, like it was hollow. He gave rough directions, nothing precise, but enough to make me mark another X on the search map. The next morning, we sent a small team that way. They found nothing but rock and sand, the kind of sameness that swallows mistakes whole. When you work in places like Death Valley, you get used to unfinished stories. Most end with found tracks, stranded vehicles, a long walk back to safety. This one didn't. After 10 days, the command post dismantled, leaving just a stack of reports and the white SUV which we towed out under the same relentless sun that had claimed them. I signed the last line of the closure form, but the signature felt like a lie. There's no closure when there's no trace. Years passed. I retired, moved up toward Bishop, thought I'd left the desert behind. But every summer, when the heat waves hit the news, my mind went back to that stretch of Warm Springs Road, the locked SUV, the map, the silence. Then one July morning in 2009, a familiar name popped on the radio. A hiker had turned in a weathered map found near an old claim in Butte Valley. It had a shaky X marked not far from where the SUV had been found. The handwriting wasn't Evans', but it had the same habit, small arrows in the margins, notes about loose rock, narrow pass. I felt the hum again, that same one from years earlier, the sound the desert makes when it's about to give something back. The park quietly reopened the file, calling in a few of the old hands, myself included. We studied the terrain again, the same lines and ridges I'd memorized 8 years before, but now seen through satellite overlays and better GPS. The coordinates from the new map pointed to a finger of land we'd skipped in the first search, a place so choked with dunes and dry washes we'd written it off as impassable. It wasn't far, maybe half a mile beyond our furthest grid. That's what keeps you up at night, how close almost can be. By the time we set out again, dawn was only a suggestion at the horizon, and the air already felt heavy. The new team moved slow, deliberate, checking each depression, each shadow that clung to the dunes. I stayed near the rear, watching the color of the sand change from pale gold to bone white as the sun came up. Around mid-morning, a shout came through the radio, a find small but clear, a metallic glint on the surface. I reached them a few minutes later and saw it myself, a thin silver bracelet half buried, catching light like it had been waiting for someone patient enough to notice. We marked the coordinates, bagged the piece, but none of us said what we were thinking. The ground around it felt softer than the rest, a faint dip in the shape of a sigh. Tom Mahoney, the veteran searcher who'd cracked the German family case years earlier, pressed his hand to the surface and listened like a man hearing through earth instead of air. When he lifted his palm, a puff of dust rose between his fingers. "There's something under here," he said quietly. I remember standing back, squinting into the glare, the heat warping the horizon until the mountains looked like they were breathing. That's when the wind shifted, gentle but persistent, sweeping across the hollow and pulling at the edge of the sand. For a moment, just long enough to freeze the breath in my chest. The shape of the ground seemed to pulse a subtle sink, a whisper of movement that said this place had been waiting. We called in reinforcement set markers and backed away from the depression before the wind could cover it again. As we headed out, I looked once more at the horizon, the same stretch of nothing I'd stared at 8 years earlier when the SUV first appeared. Only now I knew that beneath that stillness, beneath all that sand, the desert might still be holding its breath, and somewhere below our boots, the answer we'd been chasing had never really left. The wind picked up just after noon, sweeping along the canyon like a whisper that didn't want to be heard. We stood around that shallow dip in the sand, the one with the bracelet marking every detail we could, before the gusts buried it again. Even with the heat pressing down, you could feel something colder underneath a kind of stillness that didn't belong out here. The sand had that faint give to it, the way Earth sometimes sags over a pocket of air. Tom Mahoney crouched low beside it, didn't look up for a long time. "This isn't natural settling," he finally said. "This ground's been hollow for a while." I remember nodding without a word because once you've walked enough desert, you learn the difference between what's shaped by time and what's hiding time. We flagged the site, took GPS coordinates, and radioed for approval to start a controlled excavation. It felt strange to use that word excavation about people we still hoped might have left something alive behind. By the next morning, the site looked like a tiny military operation. Tarps were set up for shade ropes, marking perimeter lines, cameras documenting each square foot before we disturbed it. The air was sharp with the smell of dust and metal, the kind that sticks to your teeth. Every movement was deliberate, gloved hands brushing the surface, soft trowels tracing edges, small tools made for patience, not speed. When we hit the first piece of timber blackened and cracked, Tom exhaled through his teeth. "Old mine shaft," he murmured. I'd seen a few over the years, relics from the 1930s, when men came out here chasing dreams buried in rock. They were always trouble unstable, forgotten quietly dangerous. We cleared sand away layer by layer, revealing beams that looked ready to crumble if you breathed too close. The structure went deeper than any of us expected, about 10 feet before the sand turned darker, heavier damp from air trapped below. When we lowered a narrow probe with a camera attached, the signal blinked back a dark void edges of stone and an unmistakable hollow space. It wasn't large, but it was enough. The data feed showed a glint, then something fabric-like caught on a piece of collapsed wood. I watched Tom's face tighten. "We're going down," he said quietly. "You don't forget the sound of a place like that giving way. The sand doesn't roar, it sighs long and low like it's finally tired of keeping it secret." We reinforced the entrance with timber braces and set ropes around our waists. I went second, following Tom's boots into the narrow cut. The air was cool in a way that felt wrong for Death Valley dry, yes, but still like a breath held too long. My flashlight beam caught walls slick with mineral dust, faint traces of tool marks, and then against the far curve of the chamber, something pale. At first, it looked like canvas or maybe bone-bleached cloth, but when I moved closer, the shapes resolved into what I already knew they'd be. Two figures side by side leaning against each other the way people do when they've decided not to let go. I stopped a few feet short, the beam steady on their faces. Time had turned them into something fragile, almost peaceful skin, drawn tight like parchment hair, matted, but still recognizable in color. They'd stayed together right until the end. Evan's arm was around Lily's shoulders, his hand curved slightly as if even then he'd meant to shield her from the dark. Beside them, the remnants of their packs lay collapsed, a water bottle with the cap chewed by heat, a flashlight fused to itself, a notebook warped and curling. The words, "Love you," were scrawled near the edge of the final page, written hard enough to cut through. We backed out slow, one step at a time, saying nothing. Above ground, the sun had shifted high again, the sky that washed-out blue that makes you squint even in shade. I walked to the edge of camp and sat on a rock, the radio silent against my hip. Tom stayed by the opening, watching the wind start to move the sand we'd just cleared. "They weren't lost," he said finally. "They found exactly what they were looking for." He didn't mean it as poetry. He meant it as fact. Forensics moved in next quiet professionals who treat sites like this with the gravity of a church. They cataloged each item, measured, photographed, collected samples of wood and soil. I kept back close enough to answer questions, but far enough to breathe. When they lifted the bodies, they did it like handling glass, the desert air swirling around them in small eddies. There was no rush, no raised voices, just that steady rhythm of purpose that fills the space where grief would otherwise go. Back at base, the forensic report came through piece by piece. Dental matches confirmed first, DNA later. Everything lined up with the missing persons report from 2001. The notebook was logged as evidence, though we all knew it would never read like a case file. It read like a diary of waiting notes about the roof caving in, about rationing water, about holding on. The last lines hit everyone hard. Still together, still waiting. Those words don't leave you. They find a place somewhere behind the ribs and stay there humming quietly every time you think about the desert. When the news reached Emily Carter and the Hart family, the reactions were what you'd expect and what you wouldn't. Relief and grief don't cancel each other out. They just sit side by side like heat and silence. Emily cried through the call, thanked every name the sheriff read off the list, then went quiet. Lily's parents didn't speak to the press, not at first. They drove out weeks later, stood by the marker we'd left at the recovery site, and didn't move for an hour. I stayed far enough back to give them space, but close enough to see Lily's father touch the sand with his palm like he was trying to feel her pulse through it. The media caught wind within a day. Helicopters hovered over the dunes. Reporters lined the roads to Furnace Creek. And suddenly the story that had been silent for 8 years was everywhere. "Couple found in desert cave," the headlines said. "Hidden mine becomes tomb." The phone at the ranger station didn't stop ringing. People wanted theories, closure angles. Some asked if we thought it was murder. Others said the government was covering something up. The truth, simple as it was, didn't sell as well as mystery ever did. A week later, a man named Paul Crenshaw stepped forward, retired geologist, weathered skin hands like stone tools. He admitted he'd drawn the map that led us back there. Years earlier, he'd explored that area, cataloging old mineral claims. He'd marked the depression after noticing the strange way sand shifted there. "I thought it was an old shaft," he said, voice catching. "I should have told someone." His guilt sat heavy in the air, but none of us blamed him. The desert hides things too well for blame to do much good. The shaft itself, once it was fully exposed, matched records from a forgotten 1931 mining claim called the Beckett. The county archives had one yellowed sheet noting operations ceased due to instability. No surprise there. Those tunnels were never meant to last decades. The braces we found had rotted to splinters. Even the nails had rusted to dust. When Evan and Lily stepped inside, they were walking into history's leftover breath, the kind that collapses without warning. The analysis confirmed it. The ceiling had fallen within minutes of them entering, sealing them in a pocket just wide enough to survive a few days, maybe longer. Their attempts to dig out were careful, measured, almost gentle. That part broke me more than anything, that they'd faced the dark, not with panic, but with patience. After the identification was made official, the case closed quietly. No press conference, no ceremony. Just a short statement and a memo to park staff reminding us how the desert never truly gives anything up. It just lends it to you for a while. But in private, among ourselves, it lingered. Nights at the station, we'd talk less and listen more. You could hear the wind move through the mesquite, soft and restless. Sometimes I'd think about the searchers who came before us, the ones who'd scoured this same ground for the German family back in '96, and realize how easily stories repeat in places like this. Different names, same heat, same silence, waiting to collect them. Months later, when I went back out there for a final inspection, the plaque had been placed simple metal, small enough not to attract tourists, big enough to catch the light. In memory of Evan Carter and Lily Hart, lost July 2001, found October 2009. That was all. No flourish, no sentiment. Just the truth. I stood there a long time, boots sinking half an inch into the sand, the wind tugging at my hat brim. The valley stretched out forever unchanged, unconcerned the same way it had been the day they walked in. As I turned to leave, something flickered at the edge of the ridge, a shimmer of heat, or maybe just my own tired eyes. For a moment it looked like movement, like a figure walking into the distance. Then it was gone. I've seen enough mirages not to chase them anymore. But driving back toward Furnace Creek, I kept the radio off, listening instead to the tires hum over the asphalt, to the desert's long, unbroken exhale. I thought about how small the bracelet had looked in Tom's hand, how light it was, how it caught the sun like it remembered her wrist. That night, after filing the last of the paperwork, I found myself looking through the window toward the dark horizon. Somewhere beyond that line, under miles of dust and memory, the desert was already closing its hand again. You can recover remains, artifacts, even stories, but you never reclaim the silence. It always takes something back. And as I stood there with the map spread across my desk, tracing the ridges one last time, I noticed something I hadn't before: a small cluster of faint contour lines just east of the shaft, newer, sharper than the rest. Maybe an error in printing, maybe wind erosion, maybe something else entirely. I made a note in the margin, nothing more than a question mark, and shut off the light. The desert was never finished talking. It just waited for the next person willing to listen. The first morning after the discovery, the desert was unusually quiet. Even the wind, which normally prowled across the valley at dawn, seemed to hold back. The excavation site sat in that kind of half-light before sunrise when the world feels paused, as if it knows something sacred is about to happen. We had tarps spread over the shaft to keep the sand from falling in ropes coiled and labeled the same tools from the day before, laid out neatly on a canvas sheet. I stood near the perimeter line with a thermos of coffee gone cold, watching the colors shift from ash gray to amber. A few of the younger rangers murmured over the equipment list, trying to sound practical, but there was nothing practical about what we were about to do. The ground beneath our boots wasn't just earth anymore. It was a grave. When the forensic team arrived, they moved with the quiet authority of people who have done this too many times before. Clipboards, gloves, evidence tags, all handled with a calm that didn't feel cold, just necessary. Tom Mahoney stood a few feet from the edge, one hand resting on his hip, the other shading his eyes. "We start at the mouth," he said softly, "and we don't stop until we reach daylight on the other side." He didn't mean the literal kind. Everyone understood that. The first shovels went in just after 7. We didn't use heavy machinery. It was all slow, deliberate scraping, the kind that lets the desert give up its secrets on its own terms. By mid-morning, the air was shimmering again. The heat pushed at our backs and the sand clung to the sweat on our arms. We worked in rotations, 20 minutes each, trading out as the sun climbed higher. After a few hours, the ground began to soften, then dip. Every time we paused, I could hear the desert breathing, that low hum when the air moves through empty space. Around noon, one of the techs dropped to her knees and brushed away a handful of sand with her gloved fingers. The color beneath changed darker, cooler. "Wood," she whispered. "We cleared more." The shape came into focus, rotted beams and rusted wire, the remains of a structure long buried. The beams weren't supporting anything anymore. They were just ghosts, holding their own weight out of habit. The smell that came up from below wasn't decay, not in the way people imagine. It was dry air and stone dust and the faint mineral scent of something that had been sealed away too long. Someone rigged a light at the edge, lowered it on a cord, and the beam cut through the dark like a slow breath. For a moment, everything inside glowed gold wood rock and something softer between them. When they found the bodies, there was no announcement. No gasp, no outburst. Just that long silence that falls when everyone suddenly knows they're standing in a holy place. The figures were exactly where the probe camera had shown them, side by side, pressed close, their outlines softened by the years, but unmistakably human. We took our time. Every handful of sand removed was bagged, every fragment logged. The notebook was found first wedged near what had been the woman's pack. The pages were curled but intact. I didn't read them then, I couldn't, but I saw the way the lead investigator held it like it was alive. The removal took 3 days. The heat never relented, not once. We worked before dawn and after sunset, headlamps cutting narrow tunnels of light through the dark. I remember the sound of brushes on stone, the quiet shuffle of boots, and the constant low static of radios checking in with bass. No one spoke unless it was necessary. You learn in moments like that reverence has its own language, measured steps, slow breathing, patience. When the bodies were finally lifted out, they were wrapped not in plastic but in white canvas sheets, the kind used in historical preservation. Someone, maybe one of the techs, maybe Tom, placed a single rock on each covering before they were carried out. A small gesture, but it felt right. Back at the lab near Furnace Creek, the confirmation came quickly. Dental records, bone structure, even the tiny scar on her jaw from an old bicycle accident, everything matched. The DNA sealed it. Evan Carter and Lily Hart, missing 8 years, found together in a collapsed mining shaft. The sheriff's office called me in that night to sit in on the call to the families. I'd done it before, but it never got easier. Emily answered on the first ring. I could hear her breathing as the words came through the speaker, each one falling heavy. She didn't cry right away. She just said, "They were together." When we said yes, she let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a sigh, the kind that empties you completely. The days that followed blurred together press inquiries, interviews, paperwork. News vans lined the access road like it was a parade route. Reporters wanted every detail, what they were wearing, how long they'd survived, what the notebook said. We gave only what we had to. I saw myself on the local station that week, standing at the site with my hand on my hat brim, squinting into the sun. I looked older than I felt. It didn't take long for the story to grow legs. The internet twisted it into something else. Mystery, conspiracy, even whispers of government cover-ups tied to old military ranges nearby. People always want the extraordinary explanation when the ordinary one is unbearable. I ignored most of it, but one night a man named Paul Crenshaw came forward asking to speak with the Park Service. He was small, wiry, probably in his late 60s, and carried himself like someone used to the desert's weight. He'd been a geologist in his working years, mapping the valley's fault lines and mineral beds. When we sat down across from each other in the ranger station, he looked at the floor more than he looked at me. "I think I drew that map they found," he said. He explained how years earlier he'd been out near Butte Valley cataloging mineral seams when he came across a depression in the sand that didn't match the surrounding terrain. He marked it with an X in his notes, meaning to file it as a potential sinkhole, but I never did. He admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Too small. Too far out. He'd tucked that old hand-drawn map into a metal box near one of the claims, the same box a hiker found years later. His hands trembled when he spoke. "I should have told someone," he said. "Could have saved them." I told him what I believed, that it wasn't his fault that the desert keeps its secrets until it decides otherwise, but he didn't seem to hear me. Guilt has its own gravity. Once it grabs hold, it doesn't let go. The shaft itself had a name once, the Beckett. The records showed it was dug in 1931 by a small operation chasing a rumor of gold. It lasted 2 seasons before they abandoned it. The paperwork was clear enough. Ceased due to structural instability. That was the phrase. The men who left it had probably assumed the desert would swallow the opening, and they were right. Over time, the wind filled it grain by grain until it was just another dune. But what we learned from the geologists afterward chilled me. The shaft hadn't collapsed all at once. The roof gave slowly inch by inch until the last beam failed, sealing them inside. They would have felt it coming, a trickle of sand, a faint groan of wood, then silence. The air inside that pocket stayed dry and still for years, preserving everything. Their belongings, their notes, their final moments. I stayed in touch with Emily after the remains were released. She came back out once 6 months later to see the marker. The winter light made the dunes look softer then, and the air was cool enough to breathe without tasting salt. She didn't bring a camera. She stood there for a long time, tracing her fingers over the metal plaque. They loved this place, she said. They really did. I nodded because she didn't need to hear my version of the truth, that loving a place like Death Valley can be dangerous, that it takes everything you give it and still asks for more. As for me, I thought I'd found my peace with the case, but the desert has a way of reminding you it's never done. One afternoon, a few months after the site was sealed, I went back out there for a follow-up inspection. The wind had already reclaimed most of the trail, soft drifts rolling over the marker. I brushed the sand off the plaque, watched the sunlight slide across the letters, and then noticed something new just beyond the old perimeter line, a faint depression smaller than the first. I crouched, ran my palm over it. The ground was too firm to be a sinkhole, but it wasn't natural either. Could have been from shifting sand, could have been from something underneath starting to settle. I didn't dig. Some things are better left to time. But as I walked back to the truck, I kept glancing over my shoulder the way you do when you feel watched but can't prove it. The desert stretched endless and empty, the sky a hard, merciless blue. Still, I could have sworn the wind carried something, a single note of sound that rose and vanished before I could name it. Maybe it was just the air moving through the rocks. Maybe not. Either way, I knew we hadn't heard the last of it. The desert doesn't close a story without leaving one page unturned, and as I drove away, the dust swirling in my rearview mirror looked a lot like a question I wasn't ready to ask. The sand has a way of erasing what it wants to and keeping what it doesn't. Months after the recovery, that thought stayed with me. Even when the reports were filed and the markers were set, I'd wake in the middle of the night hearing the low hum of the wind through those canyons, the sound it makes when it moves across hollow places. We'd done everything by the book, sealed the shaft, posted warnings, written the final memos, but something about the stillness out there didn't feel finished. The desert doesn't give closure. It just stops talking. When the last of the forensic teams packed up, I drove back alone one evening to make sure the site looked the way we'd left it. The plaque caught the late sun, throwing that same flicker of gold that had led us to the bracelet. In memory of Evan Carter and Lily Hart, it read, "Simple words for a story too large for print." I crouched beside it, brushed away the fine grit that had already started to gather along the edges, and found myself tracing the engraving with my thumb like you might trace someone's name on an old photograph. Behind me, the wind started to rise again. It wasn't loud, just enough to move the air to remind me how quickly this land reclaims what we borrow from it. The families held a small memorial that winter. No television crews, no press, just a handful of people who had been there since the beginning. Searchers, rangers, a few volunteers who couldn't quite let it go. Emily stood near the front, hands clasped tight. She'd brought a small photo of her brother and Lily from their last trip before the desert, standing beside their SUV, smiling into the light, the sky behind them endless and blue. When the service ended, she didn't speak much. She just looked out toward the horizon and said quietly, "They finally came home." It wasn't joy or relief. It was something gentler, like acceptance, finally settling into her bones. In the months that followed, the Park Service put up new signs, sturdy aluminum warnings at the trailheads, bold lettering reminding visitors that heat and curiosity can be a fatal combination. It wasn't much, but it mattered. We added extra patrols near the remote roads and included the Beckett shaft in our safety briefings. The younger rangers, those who hadn't been around in 2001, listened differently now. You could see it in their faces when we talked about unmarked trails and old mines. It wasn't fear, it was respect. They understood that out here nature isn't cruel, it's just indifferent. As for Paul Crenshaw, the geologist, he never stopped carrying his own piece of the story. He sent a letter to Emily a few months later, handwritten and uneven. I never read the whole thing, but she told me the last line I wish I'd marked that X louder. It broke my heart a little because guilt is a heavy thing to drag through the desert. I don't think he ever forgave himself, though he had nothing to be forgiven for. He'd given us the key to finding them. Sometimes I think that's the strange bargain of this kind of work. You bring people home, but in doing so you inherit a small share of their ghosts. Tom Mahoney retired the next spring. He said he'd had enough of the desert, but I knew that wasn't true. Men like Tom never really leave places like that behind. They just stop talking about them. Before he left, he gave me his field notebook, the one he'd used during the search. On the last page, in his tight-looping handwriting, he'd written, "The desert keeps what it loves." I didn't understand it at first. I do now. A few weeks after the memorial, a reporter tracked me down for an interview. She wanted to know what it was like to find them after all those years. I told her it wasn't like finding something, it was like being found by it. The desert had decided it was time. She asked if I believed in fate. I said no, but I believe in timing. Out there, survival and discovery depend on it. A wrong turn, a late start, a storm an hour too early. That's all it takes to rewrite a life. The case file officially closed in October of 2009, 8 years and 3 months after Evan and Lily left the visitor center. The reports concluded what we already knew: structural collapse, entrapment, environmental exposure. Unrecoverable situation, the final line read, cold, clinical, and correct. But that phrase doesn't tell you what it's like to stand under that sky, knowing 2 people had once looked up at the same horizon, believing they'd make it back to the car before dark. It doesn't tell you what it means to hold a notebook full of words that stopped mid-sentence because the air ran out before the ink did. Over time, life filled back in around the edges. The searchers went back to their other posts, the families to their routines. Even the news cycle moved on. But every so often, something would stir it all up again, a hiker posting a photo near Anvil Canyon, a tourist asking about the lovers in the sand cave. It became part of the park's folklore, another story folded into the endless hum of the valley. Some told it as a cautionary tale, others as a love story. I guess it was both. Out here, survival and love aren't opposites. They just share the same thin line between hope and acceptance. The last time I visited the site was in 2011. The road was rougher than the markers half buried the landscape almost unrecognizable. The shaft was sealed, the plaque half swallowed by wind-blown grit. I stood there for a long while, not saying anything. The light that afternoon was soft golden at the edges, and for a moment the sand looked almost alive, shifting, breathing, reshaping itself around what it had already claimed. I thought about how fragile it all was. One misstep, one forgotten warning, one moment of wonder that turns into forever. When I got back to the truck, I looked out toward the valley one last time. The sky was so wide it almost hurt to look at that pale desert blue that hides nothing but promises everything. And I thought about Evan and Lily, not the way we found them, but the way I first saw them. 2 people standing at my counter, tired from the road, laughing about one more adventure before heading home. I remember the way the light came through the door behind them, so bright it framed them in gold. You don't know which moments will become memories until the world decides for you. After all these years, I still keep a copy of the map they bought that day. It's folded and yellowed, tucked into a drawer in my office. Sometimes I take it out, trace the route they might have taken, and stop where the roads end. There's comfort in knowing exactly where the lines disappear. Maybe that's why people come out here to stand at the edge of the known world and touch what's left of it. Now, whenever I drive through Furnace Creek, I slow down near the visitor center. The parking lot's been repaved, the signs replaced, but if you look closely, you can still see where the old tire marks curve toward the exit. I imagine them there waving as they pull out into the heat, completely unaware of the story they're about to become. It's not tragedy that lingers for me, it's that brief, ordinary moment before it, the calm before the sand closed in. Some nights when the wind blows in from the valley, it carries a faint smell of stone and salt, the same as that day. I like to think it's just the desert exhaling, finally at peace with what it's kept. But part of me still believes the air remembers. Maybe every story leaves a trace too small to see, but too strong to disappear. Maybe the desert doesn't forget, it just waits until someone's ready to listen again. If this story stayed with you, share it not for numbers or noise, but so their names don't fade with the sand. Because in places like Death Valley, memory is the only map we have left.